Welcome back. I've put together a branded Darklord guide that a few of you have asked for, and even if you're a new player, you should be able to know the ins and outs of this deck after this. I'm going to start off with the three biggest cards. The first Darklord, Branded Fusion, and Archlord Kristya. Branded Fusion makes it easy to get Kristya in the graveyard, and with the first Darklord's effect, you can revive Kristya to make it an untargetable monster that stops both players from special summoning. The Despia monsters are also Dark Fairies, and there's plenty of cards in the deck to search for them to make the first Darklord. If you're familiar with Branded Despia, then you already know more than half the deck. This deck can get you to the highest rank, or at the very least into Diamond. The downsides. Going second means fighting against interruptions that may or may not use up all of your resources to even put up a fight. Sometimes a single interruption can turn off the plays from the rest of your hand, but I could probably say the same for a lot of other decks, to be honest. There's also plenty of card combinations that will be a brick, and worst of all, we don't usually run hand traps because it makes the consistency worse. Here's my personal deck list that I'm currently using in Season 13. I'll also cover some extra cards after I go over this that you may want to consider for your own lists, but this is what is currently working pretty well for me. And yes, I know Branded Despia is very popular and you probably already know what the cards do, but I'll explain them so that we're on the same page. I added chapters to the video so that you can skip to wherever you want. Starting with Comedy, this is a pretty great card to fish for information on the opponent's hand traps. If you already have Aliber in your hand, then consider searching Comedy with opening. If the opponent knows that you have Comedy in your hand and they still use Veiler or Imperm on your Aliber, then you can assume that they also have another interruption in their hand. Otherwise, they would save it if they don't have Ash for your Branded Fusion. If Branded Fusion resolves and you summon Lubellion, now you have this card to discard since it also has a graveyard effect. Tragedy is the best card to discard with Branded Opening since you can search another Despia monster while also chain blocking your Aliber. If you want to play around Veiler, then you use it in the draw or standby phase, but if you also have Triple Tactics talent in your hand, then maybe just use it in the main phase to possibly take advantage of the interruption. If there's a branded spell or trap that you need, then you can send it to the grave with Foolish Burial or Branded Opening and then use the graveyard effect to recycle. Ukobak sends a Darklord card to the grave, but it's not usually your normal summon. The idea is to special summon it in later turns to send the card that is most useful in your scenario, but maybe the rest of your hand could benefit from whatever you send. For Albaz, we play 2 just like most branded decks. There needs to be at least 1 in your hand or in the deck so that you can use Branded Fusion. It's also not usually your normal summon, but if you're sure that the effect will resolve, then go for it if it's the best play. It's a good way to force the response at least. Indulge Darklord can be your normal summon, but you have to realize that if your effect resolves, then you'll be locked into fairy effects for the rest of the turn. So that means no branded cards. And if you normal summon Indulge, then you're most likely getting more Dark Fairies so that you can summon the first Darklord, or maybe you're setting up for IP for the opponent's turn, for example, or searching for Ixchel so that you can use her Draw 2 effect. Aliber is your main normal summon and is the main card that you search off of Tragedy or Branded Opening. Even if you have Branded Fusion, you can summon it and see if they have a hand trap. If you feel like they have Ash Blossom, you could also search for Theater and go for the first Darklord and other Darklord plays, assuming you have the resources. Amdusk's effect sends itself in another Darklord card to recycle any Darklord card in the graveyard, including itself. So this is useful when you have Contact, so that Amdusk ends up in the grave, and now you recycled Contact, so that you can revive it, and then go from there. Both Amdusk and Ixchel can copy the effects of a Darklord spell or trap in the graveyard by paying 1,000 life points, but also know that they can only be special summoned once per turn. Kristya stops both players from special summoning while on the field, and since it's a fairy, that means you can summon it from the grave or the hand with the first Darklord, or even with Branded Expulsion if you need to. It can be special summoned from the hand if you have 4 fairies in the graveyard, but that part of the effect doesn't happen that often. Superbia can miss timing. I just need to make that very clear. When you revive Superbia, it needs to be on Chain Link 1, so that means if you use the first Darklord's effect, Contact, or even Branded Expulsion, but it will miss timing if you copy the effect of Darklord Contact with Ixchel or Amdusk. It's pretty dumb. Superbia definitely helps with getting the materials to link summon, so whenever you have Darklord Contact, always think that if you have Superbia in the graveyard, then you can use that to revive Superbia, which revives another fairy, which would also be a way to revive that fairy in attack position. Dramaturge special summons itself if you used it for fusion material, which helps when you need that extra material to make the first Darklord afterwards, for example. Take advantage of its negate, since it triggers even if you're the one special summoning from the extra deck. And just like Dramaturge, Ad Libitum's effect triggers when used as a fusion material to revive a Despia or level 8 or higher fusion monster. This is a great branded in red target so that you can interrupt the opponent on their turn. Darklord Ixchel. So there's a lot of Darklord cards in the deck, and it's very likely that you'll have a combination of Darklord Ixchel and a different one, or any Darklord card plus banishment, so you can search Ixchel, and then you can use her effect to discard herself and another card so that you can draw 2. If you have Branded Fusion and you're able to use her effect, it's a good way to bait Ash so that Branded Fusion's safe. And most of the time they will Ash Ixchel because it's a draw 2 effect. Morningstar has to be tribute summoned, but if you can resolve its effect, then that means that you can special summon Darklord monsters up to the number of effect monsters that your opponent has. Then you can use its effect again to mill cards up to the number of Darklord cards on the field. This can dump a lot of useful cards in the grave, especially Darklord spells and traps that Ixchel or Amdus can copy the effect of. Even though Ixchel and Amdus can only be special summoned once per turn, they would be special summoned at the same time, so you're able to do multiple. Also note that if you can fusion summon the first Darklord using Morningstar as material, you can destroy all cards the opponent controls. Morningstar can also not be targeted if there's another Darklord monster that you currently control, which would most likely be condemned. Foolish Burial will most likely be used to send Tragedy, just like we mentioned earlier, but if you're in a good spot, then send the monster that will take advantage of your situation. Gold Sark is pretty much for Tragedy and nothing else. You can banish Kristya so that you can bring it back with Branded Expulsion though. Banishment searches any Darklord card except itself. A lot of the times you'll search Ixchel if you have another Darklord card to take advantage of her effect. Contact revives any Darklord monster in defense, and if you have Superbia in the grave, then that's potentially 2 summons with this card. If you revived Ixchel or Amdusk, you can also copy the effect of Contact to revive an extra Darklord monster. Triple Tactics Talent's usefulness depends on your situation, but it's pretty great at eating a negate a lot of the times. Branded Fusion is the #1 way to get Kristya Lock started. You can send Kristya to the grave to summon Albion, and then Mirror Jade. If you have Tragedy in hand, you can banish it with Albion's effect to summon Lobelion to trigger 2, and then go from there. I'm only playing 1 field spell in my list since I prefer to search it with Alibur when I need it, but up to you if you want to play 2. It's a great way to fusion summon once per turn with it, but it has to be on the field for it to resolve. And it also has a revive effect to bring back a level 8 or higher fusion if you were to have a face-up fairy monster leave the field, which also means you can crash your monster into the opponent to trigger it. It's pretty good when you're playing defensively and need to block attacks, especially when Alibur summons itself from the grave if a fusion monster leaves your field. Called by the Grave is to protect yourself from hand traps most of the time, but maybe there's a better target you should go for in your situation. Normally you'll be using it on Ash. Droplet is great going second to negate their monsters, but you can also set it turn 1. If your opponent targets one of your monsters, you can send your monster to the grave with discard so that it can resolve as an example. The opponent can respond with monster effects if you send a monster, but if you're worried about a spell or trap, then you can also send one of those too. Branded Opening can search and summon any Despia monster that we talked about earlier, but you could even discard a card that you want in the grave at that given moment, for example. Branded in Red brings back a Despia monster from the grave to then fusion summon, which is a great way to add an extra interruption on the opponent's turn. Your biggest worry will be Called by the Grave, or even Ghost Spell, since that will stop this effect completely. If you use Ad Libitum with Branded in Red, you can use one of your fusion monsters as materials and then bring it back with Ad Libitum's effect, which is normally what you would do with Mirror Jade so that you can use its effect again. Rebellion is the only Darklord trap that I'm using, and it's useful for a few things. You can destroy Floodgate, can send a Darklord monster to the grave after you use their effect so that it can resolve under skill drain, or to even use Rebellion twice in a turn by having Amdusk or Ixchel copy its effect. Can even be used to destroy your own monster if your opponent targets it, for example. Branded Expulsion is usually used to tribute one of your fusion monsters to bring back materials that you need, or to even bring back Albaz to fuse with the opponent's monsters. Can be used to summon Kristya too. And since you can choose the monsters that are banished, it's a good way to bring back monsters that would otherwise be gone for the rest of the game. Just remember that you have to target monsters, which means if they interrupt that, neither of the monsters can be summoned. And now for the extra deck, we'll start off with Dragostapelia. It's a monster negate, but it has to target. You can use its effect to force out a response a lot of the times, but you'll most likely be bringing it out in later turns when they've used up their resources so that you can negate their normal summon, for example. This also lowers their level to level 1, which can stop the opponent from exceed summoning or synchro summoning to a monster that they originally planned for. Albion, when sent to the grave, will let you search or set a branded card. If it gets negated on the field, then do whatever you need to do to have it end up in the grave when it's convenient so that you can get the search in the end phase. This is the main card that you send with Mary Jade's effect. Coritis makes all monsters on the field 0 attack unless they're level 8 or higher fusions. If it gets banished or destroyed by card effect, then you can either summon or search a Despia monster or Albaz, which confuse with the opponent's monsters. Just remember that Albaz needs you to discard a card to activate. Masquerade Dragon pretty much only comes out when you've done a lot of damage to the opponent so that you can put them on the clock. They'll have to pay 600 life points for every card activation. Aside from what we already said about Mirror Jade, it's the boss monster that you'll need to keep the resources coming for follow-up plays. Its banishing effect doesn't target, and can be used on your own monsters as well, which would come up every once in a while to dodge an opponent's effect that needs to target, or to banish your own tragedy to trigger its effect. It also has an effect where in the end phase it can destroy all the opponent's monsters if it was sent to the grave, but that's only when it was fusion summoned and not special summoned from other ways. It sends Albion to the grave to search in the end phase, force out a response. This guy's pretty useful. If you have Kristya in your hand, go into Libellion. Sometimes your hand doesn't look too good and only have branded fusion as your play, so you'll go into Libellion and send Tragedy with Albaz. Tragedy searches for ad libitum so that you can use branded in red to go into Guardian Chimera and bring back Mirror Jade. This card also recycles monsters back into the deck so that you always have resources. We just mentioned Guardian Chimera, but it's a good card to destroy their back row, especially in the end phase with branded in red when they just set them since they can't activate them in the same turn. Works very well with ad libitum so that you can bring back a fusion that you just used to bring it out. It's also another card that lets you draw as part of the effect, but it needs to also be able to destroy cards on your opponent's side of the field or else it cannot activate. The first Darklord. All fairies you control are untargetable, and you can pay 1000 life points to special summon a fairy from the hand or the grave. I do want to mention there's cards like Zombie World that make it harder to bring out first Darklord or use its effects, but you'll still be able to special summon a fairy from the hand though. It's weak to non-targeting removal, and there's plenty of deck types that can bring out a monster that can increase its attack to run over it. It does have a board wipe effect, and could be one of the plays that you need to do every once in a while, and to use this effect, you'll need to use Morningstar as fusion material when you bring this guy out. Condemned Darklord is probably my favorite part of the deck, because if you can summon and resolve the search effect, you're setting yourself up for a flashing win. So when it's your turn and you have 2 fairies on the field and a normal summon, bring out Condemned. Her effect discards a card to search Morningstar, summon Morningstar with her effect, and now with Morningstar's effect, you'll summon a Darklord monster for each effect monster that your opponent controls. If you fusion summon the first Darklord right here, you'll get a board wipe and most likely have enough for lethal damage. With Branded Expulsion, you can bring back 2 fairies to do all of this, for example, Tragedy and Alibur. Alibur searches a card to your hand and now you can link them off to do it. IP is pretty much for going into Underworld Goddess, or when you need to send one of your monsters to the grave, maybe to use Tragedy's Graveyard effect for example. IP most likely comes out when you have the first Darklord to revive Superbia, which then revives the second monster so that you have enough for her to link off on the opponent's turn. And lastly, with Underworld Goddess, she doesn't come out that often, but it's used for getting rid of a problematic monster your opponent has. This can be Megaclops if you're going up against Numeron, for example. Other cards to consider that I'm not currently using. Reasoning. It's better in the Darklord Despia variant, but I've used it in the past in this deck with success. It's risky using it when you go first since you have a chance of summoning Albaz or accidentally dumping Morningstar since that can't be summoned this way. Evenly Matched. Great going second card to banish your opponent's board, although you have to bait their negates to have this go through. Dark Ruler No More. Another great going second card. Negate your opponent's monsters to get set up to clear their board and set up for the following turn. Appaloosa. For when you want more value out of IP. If you manage to make the first Darklord and end up with Superbia in the grave, you can revive it, which then revives another, and now you can make IP, so that you can use her effect on the opponent's turn to make at least a 3 material Appaloosa that can't be destroyed or targeted by card effects. Dark Charmer. It's a great way to steal a dark monster to use to your advantage. If you feel like there's a ton of opponents in your ranked games that are using dark monsters, then consider this. Proscanion. If you manage to bring this one out, it's going to do a lot of work for you. If you're running a variant of the deck with Super Poly, then consider using this card. It's also great against Proto since it is a light type. Starving Venom Dragon. Just like Proskenion, this is another Super Poly target. It's a good way to have a lot of attack to go over a monster like Megaclops, Arrival, stuff like that. Mud Dragon. Another Super Poly target, but in my experience, didn't really come up that often unless you used Verte to change their type to Dark, but we don't really use Verte anyways. Sanctified. You could run this over Rebellion if you'd want to have a monster non-targeting negate instead of a non-targeting pop. And now for some replays. I chose this one specifically since I had plenty of options. When starting off, take a second to find out if you are able to do the Kristya lock. You will need 3 Dark Fairies, a way to fuse them to make the first Darklord, and a way to send Kristya to the graveyard. If you're able to, you'll want to start off with the Darklord cards to see if you can bait an Ash or an Interruption. Darklord cards work with each other, so if you use a lot of them, you might be able to convince your opponent that you aren't running Branded and make them use an Interruption early. Ixchel's effect drew us into the right cards, but we're still going to be using more Darklord cards first. Contact will revive Ixchel, and Ixchel can copy the effect of Banishment to search another Darklord card. Before summoning Alibur, I'm going to send Tragedy to the grave to search for Comedy. In case they have something like Imperm that targets, you can protect Alibur with it. Branded Fusion will send Kristya to the graveyard to make Albion, and you can either go into Mirror Jade or Lobelion. Since I have plenty of materials to make the first Darklord, I'll go into Lobelion so that I can recycle the Albion that was banished. Now I'll use Theater to make the first Darklord, while leaving Ixchel on the field. Since we have Superbia in the graveyard, I'll revive it first, and then Kristya. I'll set Rebellion so that I can use it twice on the opponent's turn. When I first use it, I'll send Superbia to the grave to activate it, and then after that resolves, I'll be able to use it again with Ixchel's effect. Normally I use Mirror Jade's effect on the first turn so that I can set Branded in red as a plan B with Albion's effect, but I felt pretty safe with this setup. For this next replay, I'll be using the one from my previous video where I start turn 3 with 2 fairies on the field. Remember that if you want to do the Condemned Darklord combo, you can't use Branded Fusion since that locks you into fusions for the turn. I'm going to link them off to make Condemned, and then activate it by sending 1 card from my hand to search for Morningstar. With Morningstar, you'll get the option to tribute summon it by banishing 2 monsters from the graveyard with Condemned's effect. Since the opponent has 2 effect monsters on their side, I'll be able to summon 2 Darklord monsters from the deck. Amdus can copy the effect of a Darklord spell from the grave, so I'll do that here. Then, I'll use Morningstar's effect to mill cards up to the number of Darklords on the field, which could send more Darklord cards that Ixchel could copy and use. To finish off this combo, I'll fuse 3 Dark Fairies to make the first Darklord, but making sure I use Morningstar as one of the materials so that I can use the board wipe effect. Remember that you can only use one of the first Darklord's effect once per turn, so figure out which one would be better in your situation. With that said, I hope you guys all enjoyed this video. This did take a long time to make, so I'd appreciate it if you would leave a rating and subscribe. See you next time.